Hi there, opera buddies. I'm glad to be back with you. Hope you had a great holiday season. And the holiday break is over for Virginia Opera. It's time for us to continue our, what I call the good cop, bad cop opera season. We started with Bad Cop. Some of you were just traumatized, I tell you, by the violence in Sondheim's Sweeney Todd. We kind of liked that show, and I think many of you did as well. But then we went to some harmless entertainment with Pinafore, and you could laugh at the hijinks. And now, well, friends, we're going back into the deep, murky waters again. This is Richard Strauss's one-act psychological thriller, Salome. And boy, there's a lot to talk about. But as you probably know, this story has its roots in the New Testament. And I think the best place to start might be to just recap exactly what the Gospels of the New Testament have to say about it. Because, for instance, the author of the Gospel according to Mark, old Mark, he was a pretty good writer. I think he can summarize things better than I could. So here's basically what happens according to what we think was the authentic story in history. Herod, who was the king of Judea, of course, Herod had sent and seized John, speaking of John the Baptist, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against John and wanted to put him to death. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom." And she went out and said to her mother, "For what should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent out an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. So there you have the bare bones of what, according to two New Testament authors, happened back in the early days of Jesus of Nazareth's ministry. Notice that the girl is not given a name. People came along later in the retelling of this story and named her Salome. And of course, this became an object of fascination for artists in all genres. There are dozens and dozens of paintings through the centuries of art history of Salome dancing or Salome with the head of John the Baptist. And people's morbid and romantic imaginations couldn't help but embellish the story somewhat. You know, the Bible, narration in the Bible is always at a minimum. There is a frustrating lack of detail in all Bible stories because they didn't have word processors. Let's face it, writing was a big job. So people read between the lines. And in the telling that Oscar Wilde made in his drama Salome in the late 19th century that became the basis for Strauss's libretto, we find that Herod has an unwholesome interest in Salome, that he is actually lusting after her. And I think they get this because, you know, for you to offer half of your kingdom to a young girl, you must have some sort of an interest in her that goes beyond stepfatherly pride. So Wilde makes a big deal out of that. And of course, when you have somebody in that part of the country dancing, you start thinking about exotic dances like belly dances. So a lot of portraitures of Salome in the arts show her naked or disrobing and so forth. And Wilde came up with the device of the dance of the seven veils. And he went a bit further as well. Not only is Herod sexually pursuing Salome, but, and this is Wilde's own invention, Salome has a sexual fascination with John the Baptist. And when that head comes out on a platter, and here I'm just going to confront the thing that is so distasteful to many of you, she speaks to that, she caresses that severed head and speaks to it as though to a living lover. And yes, that's a tough moment dramatically. And a lot of people, I think, when they hear about this, they think, oh, well, I like entertainment that has a good moral center. I don't think I'd be interested in that kind of trash. I'm here to tell you that actually it is one of the most moral stories that I know. Oscar Wilde, even though he was jailed for what was considered the crime of homosexuality in that period in the British Isles, nevertheless, he was a devoutly religious man. He was married with children. He wrote Christian-based fairy tales for children. And when I look at the drama of Salome, both in his play and in the opera that we're going to examine this afternoon, I see an extremely cautionary tale that has a traditional moral center. Because this drama, in my opinion, is all about the conflict created by two opposing human instincts: the desire for carnality, physical carnality, and the desire for spirituality. And what happens when these two come to a head, the immovable force, object versus the irresistible force. Salome and Herod and Herodias represent the physical aspect of man's existence, the carnality. And John the Baptist represents the eschewing of all of that and the desire for Spartan spirituality that denies physical pleasures. So, about this Herod, by the way, one of the other puzzling things about the Bible is that you read about Herod all the time. Herod is the guy who wanted to massacre the innocents when the Magi told him about the king of the Jews arriving. And so and Joseph and Mary had to hide their baby. And then we have the Herod who deals with Pontius Pilate at Christ's trial. And we have all sorts of stories about Herod. And if you look at the span of those times in the New Testament, you think, how old did this guy live to be? Over 100? And of course, the fact is there were several Herods. It was the house of Herod, his ancestors and his descendants, who had positions of authority in the Roman Empire. Now, the Herod in our story is a guy named Antipas, and he did rule for quite a long time. When Joseph and Mary brought their child back from their exile in Egypt, by now Antipas had taken the place of the previous Herod. And it is also Antipas who Pontius Pilate handed Jesus off to when he was reluctant to try him. And so this is the Herod of Salome, not only authorizes the execution of John the Baptist, but who refused to condemn Jesus and sent him back to Pilate. And I think you already know this Herod. This might be a little familiar tune for you.
So you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ. Prove to me that you're divine. Change my water into wine. That's all you need to, and I'll know it's all true. Come on, King of the Jews.
Yeah, I think we just sold another 5,000 tickets because everybody's going, oh, that's in this opera? No, that's a different opera. Sorry to give you the bad news there. Of course, from Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar. So that's the Herod we're dealing with. And as the curtain opens, we've got a guy named Naraboth, and he is staring at Salome while she capers around Herod's birthday party. And the fact that he's looking at her, let me go back to that theme of carnality versus spirituality. There's a lot of symbolism in this drama, a lot of metaphor. And in a sense, if I were going to give a subtitle to this opera, I would call it Be Careful Who You Look At, The Dangers of Looking. Because when you read through the libretto, there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of references to looking. People are always looking at other people. I can't give you all the examples, but there's a page, one of the pages of a young boy played by a mezzo-soprano to King Herod, who observes Naraboth, the captain of the guard, staring at Salome, and he says, you shouldn't look at her. Bad things will happen if you look at her. And in that sense, the page is being a Greek chorus, warning people about the dangers of desiring people sexually and staring at them lustfully. And when Salome comes out, she says, I had to leave because my stepfather, the tetrarch, keeps staring. He keeps looking at me with his mole's eyes. And Herod apologizes to Salome, saying, I know I shouldn't look at you like I do. And when John the Baptist comes out and Salome meets him, she is looking at him, and John says, don't look at me. It's literally every page of the drama that is studded with either saying, look at that, or don't look at that. So that's how it kind of boils down to that dichotomy of the themes. So Naraboth has got a thing for Salome. He thinks that she is one fine-looking filly, despite the page's warnings. And of course, Salome doesn't know he's alive. It reminds me of another song. Yeah, I don't think there was a village called Ipanema in Judea, but it's the exact same scenario. Naraboth has no shot with the Princess Salome. And when Salome comes out and Naraboth is staring at her, she is aware of his attraction, and she kind of bats her eyelashes and flirts with him and promises to pay more attention to him if he will bring Jochanan, which is the German name for John the Baptist, if he will bring up Jochanan, because she's curious about this guy who's always ranting and raving and preaching about how sinful her mother Herodias is. And she's curious. She's got a young girl's curiosity. I want to check him out, bring him up. What kind of guy is this? And I say bring him up because he's in a dungeon, basically, what they call a cistern, an underground prison. And when she bats her eyelashes, Naraboth can't resist. And so we have one of the first great orchestral interludes in the opera, music that is so pictorial. You know, Strauss was a great operatic master. And this short orchestral passage does so many things. First of all, it's going to have a couple of motives. John the Baptist, Jochanan, has a theme. It's very upright and righteous sounding. Dum dum da dee da dee da dee dum. And you're going to hear that motive several times in this passage. And you will also hear Salome with one of her themes expressing what I call her rapture theme, or her bliss, ecstasy theme, when she's really carried away by girlish sexual desire. A sweeping theme that goes dee-da-da-yum, da-da-dee-da-da-dum. So you'll hear these two kind of facing off like that immovable object and the irresistible force, but as well, notice how the texture of the music rises. It starts down and climbs, literally depicting the rise of John as he finally gets up to ground level. Check this out. And there he is, up at eye level where Salome can behold him. And now comes a masterstroke. We've heard John's theme, the theme that will be used when people refer to him or talk about him. Now we're going to hear the theme that I call John's righteousness, depicting his spirituality and lack of carnality. It's a very austere, severe-sounding theme. It's very angular. Dee-daw, dee-daw, bum, bum. And there just seem to be beams of radiant righteousness emanating from this music as he stands in contrast to all of the pagan folks of Judea surrounding him. Well, Salome is snowed. Her jaw has dropped down to the floor with a clunk. She's never seen anything like this man. He's different from everybody else. He's wild-looking. He's exotic-looking. It's like, a teenage girl looking at a long-haired rock star instead of the nice boy next door that her parents would want her to pursue. So now, listen carefully to this next brief motive that we hear introduced for the first time. Boy, is it going to be important. It's going to be the most important motive in the entire opera. I call it the theme of Salome's girlish femininity, her coquetry. It sounds like a girl's eyelashes kind of fluttering to me. Da-da-da-dum. Listen to this brief. You could go in one ear and out the other. But now that you know you're going to hear it, listen carefully. Did you hear that in the flute? And Salome, that wonderful artist Hildegard Behrens, who was our Salome in this recording, she has that wonderful breathless quality of girlish excitement. Salome just can't take her eyes off this guy. Now, I mentioned that Oscar Wilde wrote fairy tales. Go to Google and look them up. They're very interesting reading. And he borrows from fairy tale structure in this libretto. You know the story of Red Riding Hood. What big ears you have, Grandma. What big eyes you have, Grandma. What big teeth you have, Grandma. Children like that repetition so that it's a part of the narrative style of fairy tales. And Wilde is kind of turning this into a tale not unlike a folk tale. And so Salome stands, again, looking at John the Baptist, at Yochanan, and she says, I love your body. May I touch it? And he says, get away from me. I love your hair. Can I touch your hair and run my fingers through it? No, stop looking at me. And finally, I love your red mouth. I want to kiss your mouth. So there is that pattern of fairy tale-like 3 repetitions of how she interacts with him. And the first time when she says, I love your white body, which is kind of an anachronism because John the Baptist would not have been very white. He lived out in the desert. He wore rags. He ate locusts and wild honey. He would have been as brown as you could possibly be. But for our purposes, she thinks that he has an alluringly white skin, and she wants to touch it. So here is where you're going to hear the first full flowering of these 2 Salome themes. First, the girlish coquettishness, followed by the bliss theme. every time I hear that, I just think again, nobody wrote for the soprano voice like Richard Strauss. That is the combination of the colorful, sumptuous orchestration and the soaring, gleaming soprano lines. That's just really good stuff. This opera will be staged as long as people enjoy music. So, you've heard the combination of the two motives that add up to the portrait of Salome. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, plus dee-da-da-yum, da-da-dee-da-da-dum. Well, how does Yochanan react? We already know. She keeps looking at him. Everybody in this story looks at everybody else with agendas of all sorts. Yochanan says, "Stop looking at me. I don't want you to look at me." In fact, he tells her, "Young lady, you need to get right with God. You need to get on your knees. You need to find the person whose arrival I am foretelling, and you need to ask for forgiveness of Jesus, of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, blah, blah, blah." And a lot of critics have taken Richard Strauss to task in his writing for the part of Yochanan, which is for a high dramatic baritone. They say that he's a boring character, that all he does is rant and rave and yell. I have to disagree. This passage you're about to hear right now, in which he rebuffs Salome, I think perfectly captures his strength of character, his spiritual strength, his integrity, and it is followed by a majestic, climactic moment of the orchestra in which that spirituality theme that we heard earlier just comes out in a blaze of glory. Well, in contrast with Yochanan, the next major character we meet is Herod Antipas himself. King Herod is missing Salome. Where'd that pretty girl go? So he comes out into the courtyard where all this action is taking place to look for her. And in contrast to Yochanan's integrity and spiritual and moral righteousness, now we've got quite a little schlemiel here on our hands. He is a henpecked husband whose wife is constantly chiding and criticizing him and bullying him. He is ridden with obvious, overt lust for his stepdaughter, and he's a basket of neuroses. He's hearing things, he's hallucinating, he's drunk, he's a hot mess, as we would say these days. And again, we get the fairy tale structure of three requests of Salome. Salome, sit with me and drink wine. Salome, sit with me and eat fruit, and so forth. Here's the one I'm going to play for you. It really characterizes Herod so well. This is where he asks her to come and sit and eat some fresh, ripe fruit, some juicy fruit, and he'll take a bite and she'll take a bite. And I love this because we not only hear the passion, the illicit, kind of wrong-minded passion that Herod is driven by. Again, the orchestra is so pictorial. He is literally panting with desire. You'll hear it in the orchestra, da-dee, da-dum, da-dum, just heaving with panting. And then there are also delightful little pizzicati in the orchestra depicting the nipping of the fruit that he's suggesting. Here's Herod. Is it just me? Well, it probably is. Am I crazy to have thought that maybe Bob Hope borrowed from that passage for his theme song? Thanks for the memories. No-da-da-da-da-dum, no-da-da-da-da-dum. Oh, never mind. That's a ridiculous thought. It's probably just me. I also love the extremely bored way that Salome replies. Just can barely squeak out the words, "No, thanks, not hungry. Get away from me, loser." But then when Herod makes his big grandstand play and says, "Look, dance for me, and I'll give you anything you want, even half my..." At first she says, "I don't feel like dancing." Then he says, "I'll give you half my kingdom." And she's like, "Would you like tap, ballet, or modern dance?" Suddenly she's willing to do it because that's a pretty good offer. So we get the centerpiece of the opera, the very, very famous Dance of the Seven Veils, which has been depicted in so many ways in so many productions. In the early days, when some of the prima donnas were of the, thunderously obese and unathletic type, you would get a stand-in dancer to come in and dance for her. That's not done as much nowadays. Those of you who are afraid that this will be something where you need to hide your eyes, who maybe have seen the famous YouTube video of the artist Maria Ewing, who wound up completely full frontal nudity on stage at the climax of her dance, don't worry. We're living in Norfolk, Virginia. This is not Berlin or Paris. There are many ways to stage this dance, and we don't want subscribers canceling on us, so I am sure that it will be done quite tastefully. There will be nothing too grotesque. You'll be fine. Don't be afraid of this production. You're going to be just fine. But she does dance this number, and rather than just listen to the whole thing, which would be wonderful, I still want to break it down and show you what's happening in the various sections of it, so that when you come to the Harrison Opera House and hear it in a full performance, you'll sort of have a roadmap to guide you into what's happening. Well, it begins with quite a flurry of colorful orchestration that's meant to summon up all of our stereotypical ideas about Mid-Eastern exoticism. And what you're going to hear in this next clip is something that Hollywood composers paid great attention to, and they sort of incorporated this style into all of those sandals and robes costume epics that came out during a certain generation of film history. So here's the beginning of the Veil Dance. Very exotic. Now, she settles down and begins, she's going to build up to a big climax, and you have to come from a quieter place. So the next section is one that is very languorous and very sensual, and is designed to, of course, not only grab Herod's interest, but it also shows us Salome's state of mind. Now, I want you to listen carefully for a particular four-note theme that bears a little bit in common with the famous four notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You'll hear this, just briefly, this little motive, dum-ti-ta-tum, and that little theme has a particular meaning. It's what Salome sang when she told Yochanan that she wanted to kiss his red mouse. So the fact that we hear this theme referred to in the orchestra when she's dancing for Herod shows us that while this is for Herod's benefit, we know who she's really thinking about, and in her mind, who she's dancing for. This is how opera music shows you what someone's thinking, even when they're not saying anything. By the way, an interesting side note about how Strauss worked. You know, this dance was the very last thing he wrote. The rest of the opera was complete, and rehearsals were well underway, and people kept saying, Dick, you got that dance going yet? He said, don't worry about it. I'll come up with it. That's nothing. And he literally wrote it at the last possible moment. Must be nice to be that talented. All right, now, so did you hear the Kissing the Mouth theme? Da-dee-da-dee, da-da-dum. Now we're moving on to a central section that I would call Salome's Allure, a beautiful musical depiction of her sheer womanly beauty. Because, and I say womanly, she's growing up fast. The coquettish theme, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, is kind of girlish in nature, but there's nothing girlish about this beautiful, sensual cello theme. She's finding her womanhood as we watch her. For me, the climax of the entire drama happens in the next two excerpts that you'll hear. First, we're going to hear the complete, ultimate statement of Salome's coquettish theme and ecstasy/bliss theme. In that now she is working herself up into a highly sexualized state through this dancing. And she's not thinking of her her stepfather. She's thinking of Yochanan, because both of these themes were her visceral reaction to what she considered his physical beauty. She is staring at him even while she dances. Those of us who adore Richard Strauss, and you can put me in that group, that's why, right there, what you just heard, that sumptuous orchestration with the swirling free counterpoint and the rich harmonies and the soaring melodic lines, it just is pretty good stuff. Then we get to the climax, and now listen very carefully to this moment. Salome is the story of the disintegration of a human psyche, the disintegration of psychologically of a personality. She starts, Salome does, as a curious young girl, and she's going to end up basically as a monster, as a totally destroyed mind with only vestiges of humanity in it. And this dance is part of what's doing it. She's living in a morally corrupt atmosphere in which her mother is an adulteress. She never sees her real father anymore because Mama dumped him. And her new dad obviously wants to sleep with her and paw over her and lust for her. And she is filled with lustful thoughts for this unattainable ideal of John the Baptist. And it's all too much. There's a moment, she works herself up into a frenzy at the end of this dance. And then Strauss's great psychological masterstroke. She stops. You'll hear this eerie trill in the woodwinds, and then you'll hear a little bit of that da-da-da-dum theme, but instead of being a girlish waltz, as we heard it in the last clip, look what it's become. This is the moment when her mental framework snaps, and she lapses into madness because that theme becomes grotesque and inhuman. It sounded disoriented. It sounded, fascination has turned into obsession and fixation. And she's not the same girl from that moment on. So that in this story, it's not Herodias who comes up with the idea of asking for John's head, it's Salome herself. Although Herodias is applauding and saying, "That's my girl." She says, "I've raised you with good values, sweetheart. I like that idea." And there's a very tense moment in which Salome is breathlessly awaiting the chopping sound of the axe, which we don't really hear. People get confused. There's a glissando for the double bass in the orchestra when she's leaning over the cistern trying to see down there to see what's happening in the darkness that people think is the death of John. Strauss said it's actually her sighing in frustration and impatience. And finally, her big gift comes and arrives on a silver charger, the head of John the Baptist. And we have this remarkable final scene, a great test for a soprano, one of the great challenges in all of the soprano literature, Salome's apotheosis. And again, I want to point out just 4 or 5 different moments. At first, Salome, as I said earlier, she's speaking to this head in words of love, as though John was right there and they were now boyfriend and girlfriend. She's just cooling words of love tenderly. And of course, that passage was completely riddled with that "I want to kiss your mouth" motive. Dee da da dee da da dum. Oddly enough, this passage reminded me of another opera, Samson and Delilah of Saint-Saëns. You know Delilah's very sensuous number, My Heart at Your Feet, which has extremely exotic and lush chromatic orchestration in the accompaniment. And again, you heard those swirling flutes playing chromatic scales in that last passage as Salome is just overcome with romantic longing. There's a big disconnect in this scene that you have to get over in order to enjoy it. What we see on the stage is so disturbing, and the music is so sweet and romantic and luscious that those two there's a great irony, a great paradox, that you can have music of such heavenly, radiant beauty while something so wrong is happening on the stage. Then we're going to go back one more time and hear the girlish coquetry and bliss theme, which now she's just recalling. She's lost in her own make-believe world, and that accounts for the dichotomy that I spoke of. Salome doesn't know that anything disturbing or alarming is happening. She's completely insane. She's in her own world, and she is with her boyfriend right now, talking about his beauty, praising his beauty. Now, the next bit of this final scene is again an example of Strauss's magnificent mastery of psychological nuances and using music in order to give subtext to a libretto. That's what music does. That's why we sing operas instead of just speaking the words like in a play. Music gives subtext. And in this next passage, Salome is remarking, still lost in her own little make-believe world, that she's remembering that when she first saw him, it was as if she heard a strange music in the air. And as she says this, we hear that austere, solemn theme that we associated with Yochanan's austerity of spiritual righteousness. And we understand that the whole time that he was talking to her and telling her that she needed to turn to God and turn to Jesus of Nazareth and beg for forgiveness, she had no idea what he was talking about. She couldn't process it. It was strange music to her. It's like those of you who are parents, if you've ever tried to lecture your child about being more careful when they're driving out on the road and the kind of friends that they spend time with, and you know that what the child is hearing is yada, blah, 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 blah. They don't even hear it. That's the child Salome. That was what was happening with her. So here she is talking about strange music as we hear Yochanan's righteousness. And now comes the most poignant moment in this opera. Again, it's carnality versus spirituality, looking at people with desire or choosing not to look at them because you're after a higher plane of existence. Poor Salome, she says to this bloody severed head in front of her, she says, "If you'd looked at me, you would have loved me." This is her tragedy, that she just didn't get it. She didn't understand that there is more to life than physical desire of the unattainable, that there is choosing a higher plane of existence. And this is one of the great passages for a soprano in addition. The beauty perhaps makes it even more tragic, but this is the apotheosis, where we really drive home that concept that, no, sweetheart, looking at people is not the right path. Well, during all of this, she has an audience. She has an audience of her stepfather and her mother. Herod and Herodias are beholding this spectacle with greatly differing viewpoints. Herodias, it's her moment of triumph. Yes, that preacher is dead and my husband has been taught a lesson. Ha, ha, ha. Whereas Herod says, your daughter is a monster. Oh my God, this is sordid. This is terrible. But the worst is yet to come. By now, there's nothing left of Salome. When the spotlight turns back to her, and she is cradling this head, she is gone. She's no longer, in a sense, a human being. Her mental stability is so disrupted that, as I said before, there's nothing left but the shards of a human being, the shattered fragments of a human psyche. And this is represented by the shattered fragment of that girlish coquetry theme that we've heard all during the opera, which now reaches a true musical moment of sordidness with dark echoes in the orchestra framing it. One of the most beautifully, effectively, wonderfully grotesque moments in all of music drama, which just leaves us with the final moments. And again, Strauss comes up with a wonderful bit of musical imagery here. Salome is raving now. She is out of control. Her music is soaring and magnificent, but the orchestra understands what's going on. The orchestra becomes like a character here, kind of like a Greek chorus. And after her final utterance, the orchestra is going to start to play her ecstasy theme, da-dee-da-dee, da. But as you'll hear, they can't keep it up. They play a chord in the middle of it of such dissonance that it sounds like the orchestra is screaming in horror at the character that they are depicting, which I think is exactly what's going on. Herod finally can't take it anymore. He's horrified as well. He orders his guards to kill her, and as either the curtain falls or the lights go out, the libretto says that she is crushed underneath their shields. So listen to an orchestra that can't take it no mo and screams in revulsion. Well, now look, that's my look at Salome. Let me just say this to you. If you have been thinking, I'm going to wait for La Traviata, that's nicer. I like prostitutes with a heart of gold and lovely dance melodies. I think I'll just give Salome a miss. I'm begging you. This is more than an opera. It's an event. You need to come and see it. Don't be under the impression that somehow this opera glorifies sexual depravity. The radiant music may lead you to think so, but think about what is really being said. The important thing is that it really is an extremely moral story. It's not glorifying sexuality and depravity. It's showing you the monstrous results of living life under those standards. It's showing what happens when you pursue carnality. Nothing good. That's what Marie Duplessis, the inspiration for Violetta Varari of our next opera Traviata, found out. She lived a life of pagan hedonism, and she didn't meet with a very good end either. This is a story that makes it clear that the hero is Yochanan, the martyr, who died upholding standards of spirituality and righteousness. And in addition, you have to see this performance, because Salome, think of this role. You have to show a psychological progression from a curious, sexually awakening young girl who goes through the transformation into a highly sexualized woman, and then finally a psychotic, inhuman monster, all within the space of a single act. And she sings some of the most glorious and yet demanding soprano music ever composed. And plus, she's got to dance. That's a really burdensome onus on the artist cast in Salome. So we hope that you'll come and see how our artist does. This is an opera that everyone who calls themselves an opera lover should see. I expect you to be there. I know you'll be.